No, don't look, please, she begged. The rancher froze in shock. The sun scorched the empty plain, pouring heat over a young woman crouched by a splintered palm trunk. She clung to a few wide leaves, trying to hide her body from the blazing light. Sweat, dust, and blood clung to her skin, turning it raw and stinging. Emily Dawson was only 25, yet the weight of everything she'd endured made her seem older. Her tangled hair stuck to her cheeks as she pressed the leaves closer, desperate for even a sliver of safety. Bruises shadowed her shoulders, scratches streaked her legs, and a long gash at her side oozed into the dry soil. She had grown used to cruelty, too used. Mark, the man she'd married, had chipped away at her spirit day after day. His jealousy could twist a quiet word into an accusation, a glance into a crime. When his fist came down, each blow was harder than the one before. She had prayed he might stop. He never did. That morning, the storm inside him had turned deadly. Emily had seized the one chance she might ever get. She bolted from the house, running barefoot into the pale horizon. Her lungs burned, her feet tore on stones, but she didn't look back. Freedom, however brief, was worth every step. She thought she'd shaken him off, thought she'd finally escaped the shadow, always closing in. But fate had other plans. A lone rider appeared ahead, dust curling around his boots as he stepped from his horse. He wasn't Mark, yet the cold in his eyes felt no safer. Emily's voice cracked as she begged him to let her go. Her hands shook, her body trembled. The land around them held its breath. When she tried to dart away, his arm shot out, rough and unyielding. She kicked, pushed, but her strength had already been spent on flight. He drove her into the brittle grass, and her scream echoed across the prairie. No answer came, only wind and the merciless sky. When it was over, the cowboy mounted up without a word. He left her there, broken and bleeding, a shadow of herself beneath the white sun. Somehow she crawled back to the fallen palm and wrapped the jagged fronds over her skin, clutching them as though they could erase what had happened. Shame and terror tangled in her chest, until she wished the ground would swallow her whole. The hours stretched, each minute heavy. Then a sound rose through the stillness, slow hoofbeats. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. She pressed the leaves tight, staring at the shimmer of heat beyond her hiding place. Was it the stranger returning? Had Mark tracked her already? A dark shape slid across the ground as a man stepped down from his saddle. He was older, his frame steady, his face marked by sun and years. There was sorrow in his eyes, but also something firm and calm. He walked closer, careful not to startle her. The sun caught the edge of his weathered jaw as he lowered his hands to show they were empty. Emily barely breathed. Was this another threat waiting to strike, or a hand she could finally trust? David Carter stopped a few feet away. He stayed still long enough for her to see the truth in his stance. No rush, no demand. He'd met hurt souls before. He knew how fragile they could be. Emily trembled, ready to bolt, yet too weak to rise. Her lips moved, but only a sob escaped. "It's all right," David said softly, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you again. I promise." Something in the way he spoke made her pause. It wasn't pity, nor control, just calm certainty. He eased off his faded denim shirt, worn thin at the elbows but still strong, and knelt beside her. Gently, he draped it across her shoulders. For the first time since morning, she felt a thin layer between herself and the punishing sun. She clutched the fabric, tears sliding into the dust. David didn't press her for words. He slid an arm behind her carefully, as if she might shatter, and helped her stand. She leaned against him, trembling as he guided her toward the waiting horse. The ranch he spoke of wasn't far, a quiet stretch of land where danger rarely lingered. David helped Emily settle on the saddle in front of him, steadying her as if she were something delicate the wind might steal. Her breath hitched each time the horse moved, and he kept his arm lightly around her, letting her feel support without trapping her. The rhythm of hooves softened the world for a while. Heat rolled off the desert floor, but a thin breeze carried the scent of sage and dust, and she clung to that small proof that life still existed beyond pain. They reached his ranch just as the light shifted toward Amber. The house was plain wood, a little crooked from years of wind, but solid. Chickens scratched near the fence, and a dog lifted its head from the shade of the porch, tail thumping once before settling again. Emily stared, barely able to believe a place could be so quiet. Inside, David moved slowly, careful not to crowd her. He poured water from a clay jug, set a slice of bread on the table, then stepped back. "Take your time," he said. "You're safe here." Emily's fingers shook as she lifted the cup. Cool water slid down her throat, and a sob slipped out, thin and raw. She covered her mouth, embarrassed, but David didn't flinch. He just stayed where he was, hands resting on the back of a chair, waiting. Minutes passed before words found her. Mark, he doesn't stop." Her voice scraped the air. "Every day it got worse. He'd watch every move I made. If I said hello to someone, he'd call it betrayal." She swallowed hard. "This morning I knew, if I stayed, I wouldn't survive." David nodded once, a small motion that told her he understood more than he let on. He'd seen men like Mark while hauling cattle or sharing whiskey in town, men whose pride turned cruel when they felt their grip slip. He hated the way they wore their wives down until fear became the air those women breathed. Emily looked down at her torn dress. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered. "I just wanted out." "You didn't cause anything," David said, voice low but steady. "A man's choice to hurt is his own. None of this is your fault." Her eyes brimmed again, but something in his tone kept her from folding in on herself. She sat straighter, wrapping his shirt closer around her shoulders. For a heartbeat, she imagined she might actually belong somewhere that didn't feed on her fear. As dusk settled, David lit a lamp, its glow chasing the shadows from the room. He offered her a place to rest in the small spare room down the hall. Emily hesitated, then nodded, her body too tired to argue. When she lay down on the quilt-covered bed, the fabric smelled faintly of sun and horses. Clean, familiar scents she hadn't known she missed. In the next room, David sat by the window, eyes on the darkening yard. He felt the weight of what she'd shared and the threat still hanging beyond his fence. Mark Dawson wouldn't let go easily. The man's anger would track across the prairie if he thought someone had taken what he claimed was his. David rubbed a calloused hand across his jaw. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't the sort to let harm walk through his door unchecked. For now, all he could do was keep the lamps burning and make sure Emily had a place where the night couldn't reach her. She stirred once in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't catch. He listened until her breathing settled. Then he leaned back, eyes still on the horizon beyond the window, already thinking of what dawn might bring, and what kind of strength he might need to keep the promise he'd given her. Morning crept softly over the plains, washing the ranch in pale gold. Emily stepped out onto the porch wrapped in David's faded shirt, her bare feet brushing against the cool wood. For a moment, she just watched the sun clear the hills, try to believe that the quiet was real. The dog stretched and trotted up beside her, nose bumping her hand. She let her fingers rest on his head, surprised by how comforting the small warmth felt. David joined her with 2 tin mugs of coffee. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "A little." She took the mug, letting the steam warm her hands. "I woke up thinking I was still back there." She didn't need to finish. He understood. "Dreams can do that," he said. "But you're here now." Something in his voice made her chest loosen, just enough for a slow breath. They shared a quiet breakfast at the table, sunlight slipping across the worn boards. David kept the talk easy, the stubborn mule in his barn, the way the creek sometimes dried too fast in summer. He didn't ask questions that pressed against the wound. He just made space for her to breathe. By midday, Emily was helping him sweep the porch, her movements tentative but steady. Work gave her a place to put her shaking hands. Each small task felt like a piece of ground she could claim back from the darkness behind her. David watched from a distance, giving her room while staying close enough that she never felt alone. That calm didn't last. A thunder of hooves broke across the yard, scattering the chickens. Dust lifted in the distance, growing fast. David set down the bucket and moved toward the gate, jaw tightening. Emily froze, broom clutched tight. Even before the rider came into view, She knew who it was. Mark Dawson hauled his horse to a stop by the porch, face drawn with fury. "Emily," he barked, "get over here." She shook her head slowly, lips barely forming the word. "No." Mark swung down and marched up the steps, boots heavy on the boards. His hand shot out, gripping her arm hard enough to make her cry out. "You think you can run from me? Hide out here with this old rancher." His voice carried venom. "Everyone will know what you are." Before Emily could speak, David was between them. He caught Mark's wrist and twisted, steady but unyielding. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Let her go." Mark tried to shove him back, but David didn't move. Years of hauling feed and working fences had left their strength in his hands. In one smooth motion, he pulled Mark off balance and sent him tumbling into the dirt. Emily gasped, heart pounding as Mark scrambled to his feet, dust clinging to his clothes and anger burning in his eyes. "You'll regret this," Mark spat, pointing a shaking finger at them both. "Neither of you knows what's coming." He swung onto his horse and wheeled away, a storm of grit trailing behind him. The yard went still again, but the quiet felt fragile now. David looked at Emily, his eyes steady but shadowed by concern. She stood trembling, the broom still clenched in her hand. He reached out and touched her shoulder gently. No words came, none were needed. For that moment, standing there with the wind stirring the edge of her borrowed shirt, she felt a sliver of safety. Yet deep inside, she knew the danger hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. The afternoon dragged on heavy and slow. After Mark's dust cloud faded across the horizon, Emily stayed on the porch, arms wrapped tight around herself as though she could still feel his grip. The broom lay on the boards where it had fallen. David picked it up quietly and leaned it against the wall. He didn't press her talk. Instead, he settled onto the top step, close enough for her to sense him there, far enough not to crowd her space. The dog lay at his feet, head resting on its paws, waiting just like its owner. Minutes stretched until Emily finally sat beside David. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "He won't stop," she said in a thin voice. "Mark doesn't know how." David kept his gaze on the open land ahead. "I've met men like that," he said softly. "A man who thinks someone belongs to him can't see past himself. But there's a line he won't cross here. Not while I'm standing." Emily's breath caught, and tears slid down her cheeks. She didn't sob. The sound was too deep inside. She just let them fall, silent and steady. David handed her a clean cloth from his pocket. She took it without looking up, pressing it to her face. Later, he brought her a chair and poured water into a basin so she could wash away the dirt and sweat. He left her alone while she tended the cuts on her arms, only returning when she called softly for help with the wound at her side. He knelt beside her, hands steady as he wrapped clean cloth around her ribs. "Hold still," he murmured, careful not to tighten the bandage too much. She watched his face, the calm set of his jaw, the patience in his eyes, and felt a strange warmth break through the chill clinging to her bones. When the sun began to sink, David lit a lantern and set on the table between them. They shared a simple supper, beans, cornbread, and coffee. Emily ate slowly, as if she had to remember how to trust food again. Every so often she glanced toward the window, half expecting to see Mark's shadow. David noticed, but said nothing, letting quiet speak where words would only stir her fear. As night deepened, wind rattled the shutters. Emily started at the sound, then forced herself to breathe. David pushed back his chair and stood. "You need rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." "You don't have to," she whispered. "Yes, I do." He walked her down the hall to the spare room. She paused in the doorway, fingers brushing the frame. "I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again," she admitted. "Safety isn't a place," David replied. "Sometimes it's just a person willing to stand up when you can't." She nodded, eyes brimming again. For the first time since sunrise, she felt the smallest weight lift off her chest. David stayed awake long after she lay down. He sat near the front door, rifle leaning within reach though he hoped not to need it. The lamp cast a soft circle of light around him, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Through the window, he could see moonlight spilling across the yard, silvering the corral fence and the dark sweep of hills beyond. He listened for hoofbeats, for any sign that Mark might return in anger, but the night held only the rustle of grass and the soft creak of wood cooling in a breeze. Emily slept fitfully, murmuring once or twice. Each time David glanced toward the hallway, making sure she hadn't woken from some nightmare. He thought about how quickly violence could break a life and how rare it was for someone to find shelter afterward. He didn't know why fate had put her in his path, but he felt a quiet responsibility settle deeper in his chest. Whatever storms waited beyond those hills, he intended to face them, not just for her safety, but because protecting her felt like the most human thing left in a hard world. Outside, a coyote called into the darkness, lonely and thin. David rose, walked to the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, carrying the smell of sage and earth. He scanned the horizon, then let his eyes close for a moment. All he wanted was for the woman sleeping under his roof to wake tomorrow with a little less fear in her eyes. Morning came slow, spreading a pale glow across the ranch yard. David had been up since before dawn, feeding the animals and checking the fence line. He moved quietly, letting Emily sleep a little longer. She stirred when the smell of coffee drifted into the spare room. Her eyes blinked open, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't wake to shouting or a fist. Just calm. She sat up, smoothing the quilt. The ache in her ribs was still there, but lighter than yesterday. When she walked into the kitchen, David was pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He gave her a small smile. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she answered, voice soft but steady. They shared breakfast, eggs, bread, and a few sweet berries David had picked before sunrise. Emily ate slowly, watching light fill the room. She felt strange, almost like she'd stepped into a different life. Still, unease tugged at her chest, a quiet warning that Mark's anger wasn't far behind. Later, she offered to help with chores. David hesitated, then nodded. "Just don't push yourself." Together they fed the chickens, gathered eggs, and swept the porch. Emily's hands were still clumsy from nerves, but work gave her something to hold on to. Every small task built a little strength inside her. By noon the sky grew heavy with heat. David suggested they rest inside, but Emily stayed on the porch, staring toward the horizon. She wanted to believe the peace could last, yet she knew Mark was somewhere out there, planning. She wrapped David's shirt closer around herself. That evening, while David fixed a gate, Emily sat near the barn, watching shadows stretch across the yard. She thought of her life with Mark, the way his temper filled every corner of their home, how she had learned to walk on quiet feet, to speak only when safe. She didn't understand how love could turn into something that crushed you until you almost disappeared. David joined her, wiping dust from his hands. "You're thinking hard," he said. She nodded. "I don't know if I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder." "You don't have to face this alone," he said. "There are people who will stand up for you." His words settled over her like a calm wind. She wanted to believe him. But before she could answer, a rider appeared on the far trail, moving slow, dust curling around the horse's legs. Emily's stomach tightened. David stepped forward, his body alert but steady. It wasn't Mark. A neighbor, Mr. Harris, raised a hand in greeting. He tied his horse and walked over, voice low. "Thought you should know. Folks in town are talking," he said to David. "Mark's been spreading lies. Says Emily ran off to be with you. Says she shamed him. Some people are listening." Emily's heart sank. She had feared Mark's anger, but this was something new, words sharp enough to cut without leaving marks. David thanked Harris and watched him ride off. Then he turned to Emily. Her face had gone pale. "He wants to hurt you any way he can," David said. "But truth doesn't change because someone shouts louder." Emily pressed her hands together. "Will they believe him?" "Some might," David admitted, "but not everyone, and not the ones who know who you really are." Evening settled heavy over the ranch. Inside, David lit a lamp and sat across from her at the table. "We'll go see Sheriff Miller tomorrow," he said. "Let him hear the truth from us." Emily met his eyes. There was fear there, but also a thin thread of hope. She nodded slowly. "All right." Outside, the night stretched wide, stars bright against the dark. Inside, for the first time since she had run, Emily felt a plan forming, a path forward, even if it was lined with risk. Dawn slipped across the hills, brushing the grass with soft gold. Emily woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the quiet scrape of boots on the porch. For a moment she lay still, letting the sounds settle over her like a blanket. There was no slam of a door, no voice raised in anger, only the steady rhythm of someone tending a home. She sat up, brushed the hair from her face, and felt a strange mix of calm and unease. Safety was close, but danger still hovered somewhere beyond the fence. David stood outside feeding the animals, moving with the slow certainty of a man who had learned patience from years of hard work. When he saw her at the doorway, he tipped his hat and gave a small smile. "Morning, Emily. Thought you might want a cup before we head into town." She stepped onto the porch, holding the shirt closed around her. The dog ambled over, nose nudging her leg. She bent to scratch its head, surprised at how natural the touch felt. "Morning," she murmured, her voice still waking. Over breakfast, David explained the plan. "We'll talk to Sheriff Miller," he said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "He's a fair man. If anyone can keep Mark from twisting the truth, it's him." Emily nodded, though her hands stayed tight around the mug. "I don't know if I can stand in front of all those people," she admitted. "What, they don't believe me?" "They might not at first," David said. "But truth has weight. If we speak it plain, it'll stand." She studied his face, the quiet certainty in his eyes, and felt a thin thread of strength wind through her chest. Maybe she could face the voices that had always tried to drown her. They saddled the horse together. David lifted her gently into the saddle, careful of her ribs, then swung up behind her. The ride into town was slow, the air cool and full of morning light. Fields stretched wide on either side, dotted with sage and the occasional jackrabbit darting between shadows. Emily leaned against the steady rise of David's chest, letting the sway of the horse settle her nerves. As they neared the edge of town, voices floated on the breeze. Early talk from the saloon porch, a hammer striking at the blacksmith shop. But mixed in with ordinary sounds came the bite of gossip. Mark's name, hers David's. Each word stung like grit against skin. David guided the horse through the main street, eyes steady ahead. People looked up from their work. Some nodded politely. Others turned away or whispered behind hands. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She wanted to disappear, yet David's hand at her waist kept her steady. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Miller stepped outside, heavy boots settling on the boards. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and a face that spoke of years balancing fairness against the wild edges of the land. "Morning, David," he said. "Mississippi." His gaze softened as he looked at Emily. "Heard there's trouble." David spoke first, voice calm but firm. He told the sheriff about Mark's temper, the blows, the lies now spreading like fire. Emily stood beside him, clutching the edge of her borrowed shirt. When her turn came, her voice shook, but she found words. She told Miller about nights spent waiting for anger to fall, about running barefoot into the desert because staying meant losing herself completely. The sheriff listened without rushing her. He asked clear questions, giving her time to answer. When she faltered, David's quiet presence helped her steady again. By the end, Miller's jaw was set. He called 2 deputies over. "Bring Mark Dawson in," he said. "No one gets to hide behind stories while a woman stands here carrying scars." Emily's knees nearly gave out with relief. She leaned into David, tears sliding down her cheeks. Not the bitter kind she'd known, but tears that tasted almost clean. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, some faces uneasy, some ashamed. Miller spoke loud enough for them to hear. "A man who harms his wife isn't a man defending honor. He's a coward. This town won't stand behind that." Mark's shouts rose from down the street as deputies led him in chains toward the jail. He spat curses, but the words no longer carried the same weight. Emily stood straighter, clutching David's sleeve, watching the dust settle behind the man who had once ruled her life. When it was over, Miller tipped his hat to her. "You're safe here," he said, "but healing takes time. Let yourself breathe." David placed a gentle hand on her back as they walked to the horse. Emily climbed up slowly, looking back once at the small group still lingering by the jail. Some nodded to her, others looked away, but the air felt different, cleaner, as though the truth had shifted something larger than just her own fate. On the ride home, sunlight spilled across the prairie. Emily rested against David, exhausted yet lighter than she'd been in years. For the first time since she'd fled into the wild, she felt the faint shape of a future stretching beyond fear. The next few days on the ranch felt different, like the air itself had cleared. Emily helped David mend fences, sweep the porch, and feed the animals. Her hands were still tender from cuts, but each chore built a quiet rhythm inside her. She laughed once at the stubborn mule refusing to leave the water trough, and the sound surprised them both. It wasn't loud, but it was real. David watched from the shade of the barn, hiding a smile. He didn't want to push her, just let moments come as they wished. Every now and then her eyes flicked toward the hills, searching for a rider who never appeared. But her shoulders were no longer locked tight all the time. Sometimes she even stood tall, hair lifting in the breeze. One warm afternoon, a wagon from a nearby homestead rolled up. A neighbor woman named Ruth climbed down, holding a basket of eggs. She hesitated at the porch, eyes darting from David to Emily. "Brought these by," she said, placing the basket on the step. Her voice was kind but quiet, as though afraid to get caught between stories. Then she nodded and drove away without waiting for a reply. Emily stared at the basket, fingers brushing the shells. "Even kindness feels like it's hiding something," she said softly. David stepped closer. People don't always know how to act when truth shakes up a lie they believed. Give them time. That evening, they shared supper by lamplight. David spoke about the coming rains, about how the fields might turn green if the season was generous. Emily listened, head resting on her hands. The words weren't grand, but they steadied her like pegs hammered into shaky ground. Later, as the last glow of sunset faded, David saddled his horse. Emily frowned. "Where are you going?" "Just checking the far pasture," he said. "Won't be long." She hesitated, then blurted, "Don't stay out too late." The words came out sharp with worry, and she looked down, embarrassed. David gave her a gentle smile. "I'll be careful." She waited on the porch while he rode away, dusk gathering behind him. The quiet felt heavier without his calm nearby. She tried to focus on folding laundry on the creak of the windmill, but her eyes kept drifting toward the darkening trail. When the dog growled low in its throat, her body tensed. A figure appeared near the edge of the property, moving slow on horseback. Her heart jumped until she saw the glint of a badge in the last light. Sheriff Miller approached, tipping his hat. "Evening," he called. "Didn't mean to startle you." Relief washed through her, though her hands still shook. "Everything all right?" He dismounted, tying his horse to the post. "Just checking on you both. Mark's quiet for now, but anger like his doesn't always stay put. Keep the doors locked. Stay close to David." Emily nodded, voice small. "I don't want anyone hurt because of me." Miller looked at her kindly. "What's happening isn't your fault. A man chooses the harm he does." When the sheriff left, night wrapped the ranch in silence. Stars burned cold above, and a faint wind stirred the grass. David returned not long after, lantern swinging from his hand. Seeing him step onto the porch brought a calm she hadn't known she needed until that moment. She met his eyes, and something wordless passed between them. Trust, fragile but growing. Inside, David banked the fire and checked the windows. Emily stood nearby, unsure if she should speak. Finally, she said, "I don't know how to live without fear yet." "You don't have to figure out tonight," he replied. "One breath at a time is enough." As she lay in bed later, Emily listened to the house settle in the dark. The boards creaked softly, the dog sighed, and somewhere beyond the walls David's quiet footsteps moved as he checked the locks one last time. She closed her eyes and held on to the thought that not all people turned cruel. Some stayed steady, even when the world tried to bend them. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if healing wasn't just a dream, but something waiting patiently for her to reach. Morning light spilled through the windows, soft and gold, settling over the kitchen table where David set out 2 mugs of coffee. Emily joined him, her steps still careful but no longer hurried with fear. She slid into the chair across from him and wrapped her hands around the warm mug. Outside, the sky stretched wide and blue, the hills calm after a night without trouble. They ate breakfast in quiet comfort. The world beyond the ranch still held its risks, but here there was space to breathe. Emily felt her shoulders drop a little farther from her ears. She caught David watching her with a steady kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice low. "You didn't have to help me." David shook his head. "No one deserves to face harm alone," he replied. "All I did was give you room to stand again." After the meal, they walked out to the corral. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage. Horses grazed along the fence, tails swishing lazily. Emily leaned on the rail, eyes on the horizon. "It feels different," she murmured. "Like the land isn't holding its breath anymore." "That's because you're starting to breathe again," David said gently. Emily looked at him, and for the first time there was no shadow hiding behind her gaze. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer owned every heartbeat. She had learned something hard and clear. Cruelty wasn't love, and shame never belonged to the one who'd been hurt. A week later, Sheriff Miller rode out with news. Mark had been sentenced to time in jail and ordered to leave her alone. The law had spoken, but what truly mattered was the quiet strength Emily had found inside herself. A strength she hadn't believed she had until David's calm gave her space to find it. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the hills, painting the sky with amber and rose. Emily rested her head lightly on David's shoulder. They didn't speak for a long while. Words weren't needed. The silence said everything about survival, trust, and the slow work of mending. When darkness came, stars opened across the sky like small promises. Emily understood now that healing wasn't a single moment. It was made of many, a steady hand, a safe place, a choice to keep standing. The pain behind her would always whisper, but it didn't get to write the ending. She did. The moral was simple, though it had taken a lifetime to learn. No one deserves to be broken by another's anger, and no one is too far gone to find shelter. Real strength isn't loud or cruel. It's the quiet courage to protect, to listen, and to rise again even when the world has tried to grind you down. Emily lifted her face to the stars. For the first time in years, she let herself believe that tomorrow could hold more than fear. It could hold a life built on kindness, respect, and the steady hope that people, when they choose to, can be better than the darkness they've seen. David squeezed her hand once, firm and sure. She smiled back, small but true, and under that wide western sky, they sat together, not as savior and victim, but as two people who had chosen to stand against cruelty and give each other a chance at peace.